I never thought I'd be the one to bring down an entire company. But then again, I never thought my boss would fire me for refusing to compromise on safety standards either. Life has a funny way of presenting opportunities for justice when you least expect them. The boardroom fell silent as I slid the manila folder across the polished table. Thomas Blackwood, the man who had smugly terminated my employment just 3 months prior, went from confidently smirking to ashen-faced in seconds. His expensive tie suddenly seemed to be choking him as he loosened it with trembling fingers. When our eyes met, I saw something I'd waited months to see. Fear. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back to where it all began. My name is Michael Warren, and until recently, I was the lead structural engineer at Pinnacle Construction Enterprises. For 8 years, I had dedicated myself to the company, often working weekends and holidays to ensure every project met the highest safety standards. My reputation for thoroughness and integrity had earned me respect within the industry, if not always with my profit-obsessed superiors. Pinnacle specialized in commercial high-rises and government infrastructure projects. We weren't the biggest firm in the city, but we had built a solid reputation for quality work that was completed on time and within budget, or at least that's what I believed until I discovered what was happening behind the scenes. It started with the Riverfront Tower project, a 40-story luxury condominium overlooking the city's revitalized waterfront district. The project was already behind schedule due to permit delays and unexpected geological challenges. The investors were getting anxious, and pressure was mounting from the top down to accelerate construction. I was reviewing the latest material delivery manifests when I noticed discrepancies in the concrete specifications. The shipment that had arrived was not the high-grade reinforced mixture we had originally specified in our plans. Instead, it was a significantly cheaper alternative with lower compression strength ratings, one that would never pass inspection if properly tested. Concerned, I brought this to the attention of my immediate supervisor, Frank Porter. "It's just a small adjustment to keep us on budget," Frank said dismissively, not even looking up from his computer. "The difference is negligible." "Negligible? Frank, this concrete has a 20% lower compression strength than what we specified. It doesn't meet code requirements for a structure of this height in a seismic zone." Frank finally looked up, irritation evident in his tired eyes. "Look, Michael, this comes from higher up. The original supplier doubled their prices at the last minute, and we had to pivot. The schedule doesn't allow for reordering. Then we need to adjust the schedule," I insisted. "We can't compromise on this." "The decision's been made," Frank said with finality. "Just update the specs and sign off on it." I stood there, stunned. "You're asking me to falsify engineering documents? That's not just unethical. Frank, it's illegal." Frank lowered his voice. "We've made these kinds of adjustments before. The safety margins in the original specs are excessive anyway. The building will be fine." His words hit me like a physical blow. "Before? You mean this isn't the first time?" Frank's silence told me everything I needed to know. I left his office in a daze, my mind racing through all the projects I'd worked on over the years. How many had been compromised without my knowledge? How many buildings were potential death traps waiting for the right conditions to fail? That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the hundreds of people who would eventually live in Riverfront Tower, completely unaware of the corners being cut beneath their feet. I thought about my own signature on those plans, my professional reputation, and the oath I'd taken as an engineer to protect public safety above all else. The next morning, I walked straight past Frank's office and knocked on the door of Thomas Blackwood, our division director. Blackwood was in his mid-50s, with steel gray hair and the kind of tan that came from weekends on his yacht rather than actual construction sites. He had climbed the corporate ladder through political savvy rather than technical expertise, and it showed in his superficial understanding of engineering principles. "Michael," he said with practiced charm, "what can I do for you this morning?" I placed the concrete specifications on his desk. "We have a serious problem with the Riverfront Tower project." Over the next 15 minutes, I laid out my concerns in detail, explaining the potential catastrophic consequences of using substandard materials. Throughout my explanation, Blackwood's expression remained neutral, almost bored. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair and steepled his fingers. I appreciate your thoroughness. Michael, it's why you're such a valuable member of our team, but I think you're overreacting here. Overreacting? A structural failure in a building this size could kill hundreds of people, and that's not going to happen, Blackwood said smoothly. Our analysis shows the adjusted materials still provide adequate safety factors. What analysis? I'm the lead engineer on this project, and I've conducted no such analysis. Blackwood's smile tightened. We had an outside consultant review it. I want to see their report. That won't be necessary. The decision has been made, and we're moving forward. I need you to update the documentation and sign off on the changes. I stood my ground. I can't do that. It violates building codes, professional ethics, and possibly criminal law. Blackwood's facade of friendliness evaporated. Let me be clear. Michael, this project represents a significant investment for Pinnacle. Delays at this stage would be extremely costly. The materials meet the minimum requirements, and that's all that matters. Minimum requirements for what? Not for a 40-story residential tower in a seismic zone. You're being unnecessarily rigid, Blackwood said coldly. Sometimes engineering is about practical compromises, not when lives are at stake. I won't sign off on this. Blackwood's eyes narrowed. Then what exactly do you plan to do? First, I'm documenting my objections formally. Then, if necessary, I'll take this to the licensing board and the building inspector. For a moment, genuine alarm flashed across Blackwood's face before he regained his composure. I strongly advise against that course of action. Think about your career. Michael, think about your future. I am thinking about it and about the futures of everyone who would live or work in that building. I left Blackwood's office with a sense of unease growing in my stomach. I knew I had just made a powerful enemy, but I couldn't see any alternative. Some lines couldn't be crossed, regardless of the consequences. Over the next few days, I meticulously documented everything I had discovered. I gathered historical data from previous projects, noting patterns of material substitutions that had never been properly documented. I compiled emails, meeting notes, and technical specifications that painted a disturbing picture of systematic corner cutting going back years. I was careful to use only my personal devices for this investigation, having no illusions about the company's willingness to access my work computer. Each night, I backed up my findings to encrypted storage that I kept separate from my home. A week after my confrontation with Blackwood, I received an email requesting my presence at an emergency project review scheduled for 8 a.m. the following day. The meeting included Blackwood, Frank, and several executives I rarely interacted with, including the company's legal counsel. I knew what was coming. The ambush was executed with clinical precision. As soon as I sat down, Blackwood launched into a rehearsed speech about team alignment and confidence in leadership decisions. The legal counsel watched me with predatory focus, clearly waiting for me to say something actionable. After careful consideration, Blackwood concluded, "We've determined that your recent conduct represents an irreconcilable philosophical difference with the company's approach. Your employment with Pinnacle Construction Enterprises is being terminated, effective immediately." Despite anticipating this outcome, the words still landed like a physical blow. 8 years of my professional life erased in a single sentence. "You're firing me for refusing to falsify engineering documents," I asked, wanting to hear them say it explicitly. The legal counsel interjected smoothly. "Mr. Warren, your termination is due to insubordination and failure to execute assigned responsibilities. Your recent unsupported allegations about material quality are not the basis for this action." "Unsupported?" I laughed bitterly. "I've provided comprehensive documentation. Documentation that misrepresents standard industry practices," Blackwood said dismissively. "Your replacement has already reviewed the project specifications and found no issues warranting concern." That stung more than the termination itself. They had already replaced me with someone willing to look the other way. "You should know," the legal counsel added, "that your employment agreement includes comprehensive non-disclosure provisions. Any disclosure of confidential company information would result in immediate legal action. The threat was unmistakable. They were telling me to stay quiet or face financial ruin. I was escorted to my office by security, given 30 minutes to collect personal belongings, and then walked out of the building I had helped design years earlier. My access card was deactivated before I reached the parking lot. Driving home in the middle of the morning felt surreal. Sunlight seemed too bright, the radio too loud. I had known this confrontation might cost me my job, but the reality of it, the abrupt severance of my professional identity, hit harder than expected. My wife, Sarah, was surprised to see me home so early. A pediatric nurse with an innate sense of her distress. She took one look at my face and knew something was seriously wrong. "They fired me," I said simply. Sarah listened patiently as I explained everything. When I finished, she asked the one question I had been avoiding. "What are you going to do now?" I had no ready answer. The logical next step, reporting Pinnacle to regulatory authorities, seemed straightforward enough, but Blackwood's threat of legal action wasn't empty. The company had vastly more resources than I did, and they wouldn't hesitate to bury me in litigation. "I need to think," I said finally. "There's more at stake here than just my job." The following weeks were some of the darkest of my life. I sent out resumes and reached out to professional contacts, only to discover that word had spread quickly through the industry. No one would say it explicitly, but the message was clear. I had been blacklisted. One former colleague was blunt enough to tell me the truth over drinks. "Blackwood is telling everyone you had a mental breakdown, that you became obsessed with imaginary safety issues and couldn't be reasoned with. He's painting you as a liability." The injustice of it burned like acid. My professional reputation, built over 15 years of dedicated work, was being systematically destroyed by lies. Meanwhile, construction on Riverfront Tower continued unabated, with substandard materials being concealed behind gleaming glass and concrete. After a month of fruitless job hunting, I found myself sitting in our backyard at midnight, nursing a whiskey and staring at the stars. Sarah joined me silently, wrapping a blanket around both our shoulders against the autumn chill. "I can't let them get away with this," I said finally. "It's not just about me anymore. People could die." "Sarah, I know," she said quietly. "So what's stopping you?" "Fear," I admitted. "Fear of what they'll do to us legally. Fear that even if I speak up, nothing will change. The system is designed to protect companies like Pinnacle, not whistleblowers." Sarah considered this for a moment. "You've always taught our kids that doing the right thing matters, even when it's hard, especially when it's hard." Her words cut through my self-pity like a blade. She was right, of course. I had been wallowing in my personal grievances while the larger issue, the potential danger to hundreds of innocent people, remained unaddressed. "I need to be smart about this," I said, feeling clarity return for the first time in weeks. "Going directly to the authorities might not work. Pinnacle has too much influence, and they've already discredited me. I need irrefutable evidence that can't be explained away." The next day, I began what would become a 3-month investigation into Pinnacle Construction Enterprises. I started by reaching out to former colleagues who had left the company on good terms, carefully feeling out who might be sympathetic to my concerns. I found an unexpected ally in Raj Patel, a former project manager who had left Pinnacle 2 years earlier. Over coffee at a small cafe far from any Pinnacle offices, Raj confirmed my worst suspicions. "It's not just Riverfront Tower," he said quietly. "They've been doing this for years. The West Side Plaza, the Municipal Courts Building, the Lakefront Convention Center, all of them have similar issues." The Municipal Courts Building hit me like a thunderbolt. I had worked on that project personally and had no idea materials had been substituted after my approvals. "How is this possible?" I asked. "How have they avoided inspections?" Raj looked uncomfortable. "There's a building inspector, James Miller. He has a convenient habit of conducting superficial inspections on Pinnacle projects. Always gives them a pass." "You're suggesting he's being bribed?" Raj shrugged. "I don't have proof, but Miller built a vacation home last year that seems pretty luxurious for someone on a government salary. This was the thread I needed to pull. If I could prove a connection between Pinnacle and corrupted inspection processes, it would be much harder for them to dismiss my claims about material quality. Over the following weeks, I built a network of informants, former employees, subcontractors, and suppliers who had their own reasons to resent Pinnacle's business practices. Each provided pieces of a puzzle that grew more disturbing as it took shape. I discovered that Pinnacle had been systematically substituting substandard materials across multiple projects for at least 5 years. The practice had begun as an occasional cost-cutting measure during the economic downturn, but had evolved into standard procedure as executives realized how much it inflated their profit margins. More alarmingly, I found evidence suggesting that several city officials, including building inspectors and permit officers, were receiving kickbacks to overlook these violations. The corruption was more extensive than I had initially feared. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Lisa Chen, a junior accountant at Pinnacle who had been laid off in a recent restructuring, contacted me through a mutual connection. She had been troubled by irregular payments she had processed but had been too afraid to speak up while employed there. They weren't properly documented, she explained, showing me copies of financial records she had secretly retained. Large cash withdrawals authorized by Blackwood himself, always right before major inspections. The records didn't explicitly prove bribery, but they established a suspicious pattern that would be difficult to explain innocently. More importantly, they gave me leverage to approach other potential whistleblowers. One such potential ally was David Rodriguez, the quality control manager who had replaced me. Through mutual connections, I arranged a meeting at a bar far from any Pinnacle facilities. David was nervous, constantly checking the door as if expecting Blackwood to walk in at any moment. I didn't know what I was getting into, he confessed after his second drink. They presented everything as standard industry practice. It wasn't until I reviewed the original specifications that I realized how far they've deviated. "Are you still signing off on the substandard concrete?" I asked directly. David looked ashamed. "I have a family, a mortgage, but I've been documenting everything, creating my own private records. I just don't know what to do with them." "Give them to me," I suggested. "I can keep your name out of it." He hesitated. "Blackwood would know it was me. There aren't many people with access to that information. Not if we get enough people to come forward simultaneously," I argued. "They can't fire everyone." Over the next month, I built a case that no one could ignore. I gathered financial records showing suspicious patterns of cash withdrawals, documented material substitutions across multiple projects, compiled statements from former employees, and even obtained soil and concrete samples that had been secretly collected from Pinnacle construction sites. The final piece came from an unexpected ally, Frank Porter, my former supervisor. Frank reached out to me through an anonymous email requesting a meeting. When we met in a quiet corner of a public park, he looked like he hadn't slept in weeks. "I can't do this anymore," he said without preamble. "Last night, I woke up thinking about what would happen if one of these buildings failed, the people who would die. I keep seeing their faces in my dreams." Frank provided me with internal emails that explicitly discussed material substitutions and the need to hide them from overzealous engineers, meaning me. Most damningly, he had emails from Blackwood himself, instructing project managers to proceed with substandard materials while ensuring documentation reflected the original specifications. "Why are you doing this now?" I asked Frank. "You were part of this system for years." Frank looked genuinely pained. "Because you were right, and I was a coward. Sometimes it takes seeing someone else stand up to realize how long you've been kneeling. With all the evidence compiled, I faced a critical decision: how to present it for maximum impact while minimizing the risk of it being buried or dismissed. Going directly to regulatory authorities might not work if the corruption extended into those agencies. The police might refer it back to those same compromised departments. After careful consideration, I decided on a multi-pronged approach. I would simultaneously submit my evidence to the State Attorney General's office, the FBI's Public Corruption Unit, the Engineering Licensing Board, and several journalists who specialized in investigative reporting. But before I launched this nuclear option, I decided to give Pinnacle one last chance to do the right thing, not because they deserved it, but because immediate corrective action would be faster than waiting for investigations and prosecutions. I emailed Blackwood requesting a meeting without specifying the topic. To my surprise, he agreed, perhaps curious about what I wanted after 3 months of silence. The meeting was scheduled for 2 p.m. on a Friday in the Pinnacle conference room. I arrived early, dressed in my best suit, carrying a single manila folder. The receptionist, a new hire who didn't recognize me, directed me to wait in the lobby. 10 minutes later, Blackwood's assistant escorted me to the main conference room. Blackwood was already there, along with the company's legal counsel and 2 executives I recognized from my termination meeting. They had clearly anticipated that this might be confrontational and had prepared accordingly. "Michael," Blackwood said with false warmth, "this is an unexpected pleasure. What can we do for you today?" I placed the folder on the table, but kept my hand on it. I've spent the last 3 months investigating Pinnacle's construction practices, specifically the systematic substitution of substandard materials and the falsification of engineering documents. The legal counsel immediately went on the offensive. "Mr. Warren, if you're here to make more unfounded accusations," I cut him off. "They're not unfounded. I have documented evidence of code violations across 12 major projects, including financial records suggesting bribes to building inspectors." I tapped the folder. "This is just a summary. The full documentation has been securely stored with instructions for distribution if anything happens to me." Blackwood's composed facade cracked slightly. "Are you threatening us?" "I'm giving you one opportunity to address this voluntarily," I replied. "Immediate inspections of all affected structures, remediation where necessary, full disclosure to the authorities." The legal counsel scoffed. "Based on what? Some paperwork you claim to have. Even if these alleged substitutions occurred, proving they fall below legal safety standards would require extensive testing that you couldn't possibly have conducted." "Actually, I have conducted testing," I said, sliding the folder toward them. "Concrete core samples from Riverfront Tower show compression strengths 18% below what's specified in the approved plans. Similar deficiencies exist in the other projects." One of the executives opened the folder and began reviewing its contents. His face gradually drained of color. "This meeting is over," Blackwood declared, standing abruptly. "Whatever you think you have, Warren, it won't stand up to scrutiny. And I remind you that your non-disclosure agreement doesn't cover criminal activity." I finished for him. "Which is what this is. I'm not just some disgruntled ex-employee. Thomas, I'm an engineer who takes public safety seriously." I stood as well. "You have 48 hours to initiate voluntary remediation and self-disclosure to the authorities. After that, everything goes to the state attorney general, the FBI, the licensing board, and the press simultaneously. You'll never work in this industry again," Blackwood threatened, his face flushing with anger. I smiled sadly. "Thanks to you, I already don't. The difference is, I can still look at myself in the mirror." I headed for the door, then turned back. 48 hours. Thomas, the clock is ticking." I left the Pinnacle offices feeling lighter than I had in months. Regardless of how they responded, I had done what needed to be done. The truth would come out, one way or another. Blackwood's response came sooner than expected. That evening, as Sarah and I were preparing dinner, my phone rang with an unknown number. It was Martin Gray, Pinnacle's CEO, a man I had met only twice during my 8 years with the company. His voice was tense but controlled. "Mr. Warren, I've just concluded an emergency meeting with our board regarding the information you presented today." I waited silently, giving him nothing. "We would like to continue this discussion," Gray said carefully, "perhaps with fewer people involved." "Are you suggesting we cover this up together?" I asked incredulously. "I'm suggesting we explore solutions that address your concerns while minimizing unnecessary disruption." Gray replied smoothly, "We could make it worth your while." They were trying to buy me off. After everything, they still didn't understand what motivated me. "The only acceptable solution is full disclosure and remediation," I said firmly. "Anything less puts lives at risk." Be reasonable, Warren. We're talking about billions in liability. The company wouldn't survive. Maybe it shouldn't, I replied. 48 hours, Mr. Gray. That deadline stands. The next morning, I received another call, this time from Blackwood himself. You've made your point, he said, his voice tight with suppressed rage. The board has authorized me to negotiate terms. There are no terms to negotiate, I repeated. Full disclosure and remediation. Don't be naive. If Pinnacle goes down, hundreds of people lose their jobs. Is that what you want? What I want is for people to be safe in buildings they trust, I answered. The jobs argument might be more compelling if you hadn't already destroyed my career. Blackwood's tone turned threatening. We've been looking into your personal history. Warren, everyone has skeletons. Perhaps your wife would be interested in those text messages you exchanged with Jennifer Davis during the Chicago project. The attempted blackmail was so pathetic I almost laughed. Jennifer had been a colleague with whom I'd had exactly one conversation about possibly meeting for drinks, a suggestion I had immediately declined out of respect for my marriage. If this was the best dirt they could find on me, they were truly desperate. Feel free to show Sarah anything you found, I said confidently. Unlike you, I don't have anything to hide. The line went silent for a moment. This isn't over, Blackwood finally said, and hung up. As the 48-hour deadline approached, I prepared to release my evidence as planned. Sarah and I discussed whether she and the kids should stay with her parents for a while, given the potential for backlash from Pinnacle, but she refused. We face this together, she insisted. I'm not letting them think they can intimidate us. At the 47-hour mark, Martin Gray called again. The board has authorized me to negotiate directly with you, he said without preamble. We're prepared to initiate inspections of all the projects you've identified, conducted by independent third parties. It was the first serious response I'd received. And if those inspections confirm my findings, then we'll implement whatever remediation is recommended, Gray said carefully, under regulatory supervision. And the self-disclosure to authorities? Gray hesitated. We would prefer to characterize this as a voluntary quality review that we initiated internally. That's not acceptable, I said firmly. The corruption aspect needs to be addressed. Building inspectors were bribed. That can't be swept under the rug. After further negotiation, we reached a tentative agreement. Pinnacle would engage independent engineers to inspect all potentially compromised structures, implement recommended remediation, and disclose the material substitutions to regulatory authorities. In exchange, I would allow them to present this as having been discovered through internal quality controls rather than through a whistleblower. I didn't fully trust them to follow through, so I insisted on one additional condition. I would hold back the most damning evidence, the financial records suggesting bribery, for 30 days. If Pinnacle failed to fulfill their commitments, that evidence would still go to the FBI and State Attorney General. Gray reluctantly agreed, probably believing they could find a way to neutralize me during that grace period. I had no intention of giving them that opportunity. The next morning, I received an unexpected call from David Rodriguez, the quality control manager who had replaced me. They're shredding documents, he said urgently. As soon as the board meeting ended yesterday, Blackwood ordered IT to purge specific email records. They're destroying evidence. This changed everything. If Pinnacle was already violating our agreement, I couldn't afford to wait. I immediately initiated my distribution plan, sending comprehensive evidence packages to all the parties I had identified: the State Attorney General, the FBI, the Engineering Licensing Board, and 3 investigative journalists with strong reputations. Within hours, my phone was ringing constantly with calls from reporters seeking comment. By evening, the story had broken across multiple news outlets. Major construction firm accused of systematic safety violations. The public reaction was immediate and intense. Occupants of Pinnacle-constructed buildings demanded answers. Government agencies that had contracted with Pinnacle announced emergency reviews. Pinnacle's stock price plummeted. 2 days later, the FBI raided Pinnacle's offices, carting away computers and boxes of documents. Building inspectors James Miller and 2 of his colleagues were brought in for questioning. the state attorney general announced a formal investigation into both Pinnacle and the city's building inspection department. The most personally satisfying moment came a week after the story broke. I was invited to a special hearing of the State Engineering Licensing Board, where I presented my findings in detail. Thomas Blackwood was also called to testify. When confronted with the evidence I had compiled, particularly the emails explicitly discussing material substitutions, Blackwood attempted to shift blame to subordinates. It was a pathetic performance that fooled no one. The licensing board unanimously voted to suspend Blackwood's engineering license pending further investigation. As the decision was announced, Blackwood's face turned a deep, mottled red. When our eyes met across the hearing room, I saw something I had waited months to see: the recognition that he had been completely and utterly defeated. The aftermath unfolded over the following months. Comprehensive testing confirmed serious deficiencies in multiple Pinnacle projects. Riverfront Tower, still under construction, was halted immediately. Other affected buildings required extensive and costly remediation. 3 building inspectors were indicted on corruption charges. Evidence emerged that bribes had been a standard practice for years, involving multiple construction companies beyond just Pinnacle. Pinnacle Construction Enterprises did not survive the scandal. Facing massive liability, regulatory penalties, and criminal investigations, the company filed for bankruptcy protection. Martin Gray resigned in disgrace. Thomas Blackwood was indicted on multiple counts of fraud, evidence tampering, and conspiracy. As for me, the vindication was professionally complete. The engineering community, initially hesitant due to Blackwood's smear campaign, now recognized that I had acted with integrity at great personal cost. Job offers began to arrive, including several from firms specifically seeking to strengthen their ethical compliance. I eventually accepted a position with the state's Infrastructure Safety Division, where I could help develop and enforce the regulations that Pinnacle had so flagrantly violated. The irony wasn't lost on me. Blackwood's attempt to silence me had ultimately put me in a position where I could ensure no one followed his example. On the day Thomas Blackwood was sentenced to 8 years in federal prison for his crimes, Sarah suggested we open the bottle of champagne we had been saving for a special occasion. Is it wrong to celebrate someone else's downfall? I wondered aloud as we sat on our back porch. Sarah considered this thoughtfully. You're not celebrating his punishment. You're celebrating that the system ultimately worked. That truth and integrity still matter. She was right, as usual. This had never been about revenge. Not really. It had been about refusing to be complicit in something I knew was wrong, regardless of the personal cost. The fact that those responsible faced consequences was justice, not vengeance. As we sipped champagne under the stars, I reflected on the journey of the past year. I had lost a job, but rediscovered my purpose. I had been threatened, slandered, and blacklisted, but had emerged with my integrity intact. Most importantly, buildings that might have failed catastrophically would now be made safe. Sometimes, standing up for what's right comes at a heavy price. But as I looked at Sarah beside me, at our home, at the life we had preserved through the storm, I knew with absolute certainty it had been worth it. In the end, my boss hadn't just fired an employee. He had created an adversary with nothing left to lose and everything to prove. His greatest mistake wasn't using substandard concrete, it was underestimating the strength of one man's principles.